That night, after my husband beat me repeatedly because I discovered he was cheating on me, I went to bed without saying a single word. The next morning, when he woke up, he was greeted by the aroma of his favorite dish, a delicious pot roast, and he smiled, satisfied, upon seeing the dining table laden with a feast. He said arrogantly, "Well, you finally understand and admit your mistake." But when he saw who was sitting at that table, his expression changed completely, and he instantly became hysterical. Before we begin this story, write me in the comments which city or country you're listening from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and bring you more and more interesting stories. That night, the rain fell in a torrential downpour, as if the sky itself were weeping for the fate that had befallen Grace's home. The hands of the clock on the wall of the luxurious living room already pointed to 2 a.m., but Grace remained sitting bolt upright on the cream-colored leather sofa. She wasn't watching television or reading a book. She was simply staring intently at the closed front door. In her hand, she held a cell phone with a dark screen, but within it lay enough evidence to shatter her heart 1,000 times over. Photos of Michael, her husband, having a romantic dinner with another woman named Tiffany had just been sent to her by a friend who happened to be at the same restaurant. Grace wasn't crying. She felt as if her tears had already run dry, because this wasn't the first time she had sensed the scent of betrayal on her husband. Yet, something was different tonight. A determination was crystallizing in her chest, a decision already made, final and absolute. She would no longer be the foolish woman who forgives to maintain the appearance of a home that was, in reality, a sham. The faint sound of a car engine cut through the noise of the rain, followed by the glare of headlights sweeping across the curtains. Michael was home. Grace took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart, which pounded not from love, but from a mixture of fear and disgust. The door swung open abruptly, revealing Michael's figure with a disheveled shirt, a loosened tie, and a strong smell of alcohol mixed with a cloying woman's perfume. Michael was surprised to see Grace still sitting in the living room, watching him with an expression that was hard to decipher. Instead of feeling guilty, he snorted in annoyance, as if his wife's presence were an inconvenience to his peace after a full day of amusement. He tossed his briefcase aside and staggered toward the stairs without even a word of greeting for Grace. Grace rose slowly. Her voice, when she asked where he had been at this hour, was calm but sharp, cutting through the silence of the night. That simple question was the spark that ignited the fury of Michael, who was under the influence of alcohol and exhaustion. Michael spun around, his eyes red and blazing. He yelled that she had no right to control his life, that to him, Grace was just a wife whose only function was to stay quiet at home and enjoy the money he provided for expenses. Grace didn't back down. Instead, she took a step forward and held up her phone, the screen lighting up to show a photo of Michael kissing Tiffany's cheek. She asked who this woman was and why he would dare to do this to her, who had always tried to be an obedient and submissive wife. Seeing the evidence, Michael's face turned a deep crimson, not from shame, but from a wounded ego. He felt humiliated at being caught. Without warning, a brutal slap landed on Grace's left cheek, so hard that her small frame staggered and fell, crashing against a decorative table. The sound of a shattering vase mingled with a clap of thunder outside. Grace brought a hand to her cheek, which burned and throbbed with intense pain. The corner of her lip was split and bleeding, but Michael wasn't finished. He grabbed her by the hair, forcing her face up to meet his eyes, and began to insult her with words so vulgar that no husband should ever utter them. Michael blamed Grace for his own infidelity, shouting that he sought other women because she was boring, too rigid, and incapable of satisfying his masculine ego. Punch after punch rained down on Grace's body. That night, Michael unleashed all his frustration. His twisted guilt morphed into rage and his sense of superiority. He struck her arms, kicked her legs, and shoved her until she was cornered against the wall. Grace felt an extraordinary pain coursing through her body. Her ribs ached with every breath, and her head spun relentlessly. However, in the midst of this storm of violence, something made Michael pause for a moment. Grace wasn't screaming. She wasn't crying hysterically, begging for forgiveness as she used to. She wasn't fighting back or hurling insults in return. The woman simply remained silent, taking every blow with her eyes wide open, looking at Michael with a vacant, cold, dead expression. Grace's silence unnerved Michael, but then his arrogance took over. He interpreted her silence as a sign of fear and total submission. Michael felt he had succeeded in breaking his wife, in teaching her never to defy him or mention Tiffany's name again. After venting all his rage, Michael released his grip, letting Grace slide to the cold floor amidst the broken shards of the vase. Michael spat to the side, smoothed his ruffled hair, and said with a contemptuous tone that this is what happens when a wife dares to disrespect her husband. He ordered Grace to clean up the mess in the morning and not to dare complain to anyone if she didn't want things to get worse. Michael went up to the master bedroom, leaving Grace still sitting on the living room floor. After the upstairs bedroom door slammed shut, silence returned to the house, broken only by the sound of the intensifying rain. Grace slowly moved her battered body. She winced in pain as she tried to stand. Her hands trembled as she wiped the blood from the corner of her lip with the sleeve of her blouse. She didn't pick up the pieces of the broken vase. She left them scattered like silent witnesses to the cruelty of that night. With faltering, limping steps, Grace walked to the downstairs guest room, not to sleep, but to lay out her final plan. In the darkness of the guest room, Grace sat on the edge of the bed without turning on a light. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated her bruised and swollen face. She felt in the pocket of her torn dress and pulled out her phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. Her trembling fingers tapped out a short message and attached a video file. That file came from a small surveillance camera disguised as a desk clock, which she herself had installed in the living room just a week earlier. Her intuition had already warned her that a confrontation like this was coming. The camera had recorded everything: Michael's enraged face, every blow, every insult. Grace looked at her phone screen, which showed the message as sent. Then she touched the bruise on her face, feeling the physical pain, but her heart felt strangely light. She felt relief. Grace didn't sleep that night. She just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to Michael's footsteps overhead, pacing for a moment before falling silent, a sign that his drunken stupor had pulled him into a deep sleep. Grace pictured the faces of her parents, Carol and Robert. She pictured the face of her brother, Andrew. All this time, Grace had hidden the shame of her marriage because she didn't want to worry them, because she had been raised to be a patient wife who covers her husband's mistakes. But tonight, the limit of her patience had been pulverized along with her trampled dignity. Grace got out of bed as the clock struck 4 a.m. Her body ached, but her mind was extraordinarily clear. She went to the kitchen not to prepare breakfast out of love, but to set the stage for Michael's final performance. She began to chop the meat, mix the spices, and cook with a calm demeanor, as if nothing had happened, though in her mind she was counting down to her husband's destruction. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of the master bedroom, dazzling Michael's still heavy eyes. He grunted softly, feeling a throbbing headache from the previous night's drinking. However, behind the haze, his sense of smell picked up a very familiar and appetizing aroma. The scent of beef slow-cooked with rich spices like garlic, thyme, and bay leaves. It was the smell of pot roast, his favorite dish, which Grace only prepared on special occasions. Immediately, the memories of last night replayed in his head. He remembered his rage, the blows he had dealt, and how Grace had remained silent, not defending herself. A faint smile formed on Michael's lips. He felt proud of himself. His narcissistic mind concluded that his performance last night had been a great success in the task of educating his wife. According to Michael's twisted logic, the pot roast cooking this morning was a sign of apology from Grace. He was convinced she had prepared it as a way to make peace, as a sign that she accepted her position as a wife who must obey and never again question the subject of Tiffany. Michael got out of bed, stretched his stiff muscles, and walked to the bathroom, feeling like a winner. He pictured Grace downstairs, perhaps with a bruised face, setting the table fearfully, awaiting his orders. After showering and changing into casual but elegant clothes, Michael left the room. He whistled softly as he descended the marble staircase of his luxurious home. The house felt quiet. There was no clinking of dishes or the sound of footsteps, only the aroma of the pot roast growing stronger and more inviting to his hungry stomach. When his feet touched the ground floor, he saw that the shards of the vase from the night before were gone. The floor was clean and gleaming. Michael nodded to himself in satisfaction, praising how quickly Grace had learned to clean up a mess without being told twice. He walked toward the dining room, which was set further back, separated from the living room by an artistic screen. Michael entered the dining area with a confident stride, adjusting the collar of his polo shirt. His eyes went straight to the large oak dining table, which was already set elegantly. In the center of the table, a large serving bowl filled with steaming hot beef pot roast was the main star, surrounded by creamy mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and crusty bread. It was all Michael's favorite menu. His stomach rumbled loudly. He smiled broadly, feeling treated like a king who had just won a battle. Without looking closely around him, he moved to pull out his chair at the head of the table, but his movement stopped short. That chair was already occupied by someone. The smile on Michael's face vanished instantly, replaced by a look of confusion that slowly morphed into pure terror. His heart seemed to stop as his eyes truly processed the scene before him. In the head chair, where he used to sit and give orders, sat Robert, Grace's father. The older man, who was usually friendly, now stared at Michael with eyes as sharp and lethal as daggers. His hands were clenched on the table, his knuckles white. The aura of authority and contained fury emanating from Robert made Michael's courage shrink instantly. Michael swallowed, the saliva tasting bitter. His eyes shifted to Robert's side. There sat Carol, his mother-in-law. The woman who usually greeted Michael with warm hugs now looked away, her eyes swollen and red from crying. Lines of deep disappointment were etched on her aged face. Carol wouldn't look at Michael, as if the sight of him were impure and painful. Standing behind Robert's chair was Andrew, Grace's older brother. Andrew's sturdy frame was tense, his jaw clenched, and his gaze conveyed a powerful desire to leap across the table and beat Michael to a pulp right then and there, were it not for ethics and the law. Michael took a step back, his legs feeling weak as jelly. He tried to open his mouth to say hello, but the words caught in his throat. "Robert, Carol, Andrew, what a coincidence to see you here so early in the morning," he asked, his voice choked and trembling. He tried to look for Grace, hoping his wife would appear from the kitchen with drinks and break the tension. "Where's Grace?" he called out in a panic, his eyes frantically searching the room, but Grace was not there. Instead of Grace, Michael's gaze caught other figures standing in the corner of the room, near the kitchen entrance and the exit door. There stood Mr. Hayes, Robert's family attorney, known for being rigorous and unbeatable in court. Mr. Hayes held a tablet and a thick file, his face expressionless. And what made Michael's blood run cold was the presence of two uniformed police officers standing beside Mr. Hayes. Their hands were poised on their belts, watching Michael with the scrutinizing gaze of law enforcement officers observing a criminal. The silence in the dining room was so oppressive that only the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. The aroma of the pot roast, once so appetizing, now churned Michael's stomach. Robert slowly pushed the plate of pot roast in front of him toward Michael, who was still standing like a statue. The sound of the ceramic plate scraping against the wooden table was shrill and jarring. "Eat," Robert commanded. His voice was low, deep, and held a real threat. There was no hint of courtesy. "Robert, what's going on?" "I don't understand," Michael said as cold sweat began to bead on his temples. "I said, eat," Robert bellowed, his voice booming through the room, making Carol flinch and begin to sob softly again. Robert pointed at the pot roast with a trembling index finger, shaking with contained rage. "Grace cooked this for you this morning. She cooked it with a bruised face, a split lip, and a heart shattered by you. She cooked it as a final act of charity for you, Michael. Eat it, because this is the last delicious meal your tongue will ever touch before you rot in a prison cell." Michael shook his head in panic, his face as pale as a ghost. "Prison? What are you talking about? This has to be a misunderstanding. Grace and I just had a normal marital spat. Where is Grace? Let me talk to her." Michael tried to step forward, but Andrew moved swiftly, slamming his fist on the table so hard the dishes rattled. "Don't you dare say my sister's name with that filthy mouth of yours," Andrew snapped, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think we know nothing? You think because my sister stayed quiet all this time you could treat her like an animal? We've seen it all, Michael. Absolutely everything. Mr. Hayes, the attorney, stepped forward calmly. He placed the tablet he was holding on the table in front of Michael. On the screen, the security footage from the previous night was playing. The video clearly showed, in high resolution, Michael slapping Grace to the ground, pulling her by the hair, and beating her mercilessly. The sound of Michael's insults and the thud of the blows echoed from the tablet's speakers, filling the dining room with undeniable evidence of his sin. Carol covered her ears, unable to bear the sound of her daughter's suffering. Meanwhile, Robert watched Michael with a look of judgment. "This is not a marital spat, Mr. Anderson," Mr. Hayes said in a formal, cold tone. "This is aggravated assault and domestic violence, based on the forensic medical exam we already had performed on Mrs. Anderson this morning, as well as this video recording. We have more than enough evidence to take you to trial and ensure you receive the maximum penalty." One of the police officers stepped forward, pulling out a pair of metal handcuffs that glinted in the morning light. The click of the handcuffs opening sounded like a death knell for Michael's comfortable life. Michael's legs finally gave out. He collapsed to the floor, staring in shock at the table laden with food. The pot roast was still steaming, its aroma unchanged, but now that scent was mingled with the smell of his own future's destruction. He realized that Grace's silence the night before was not a sign of submission, but the calm before the storm that had now engulfed him. The drive to the police station felt like an endless nightmare for Michael. He sat squeezed in the back of the patrol car, his hands cuffed tightly behind him, flanked by two burly officers who remained silent the entire way. The wailing siren, clearing a path through the morning traffic, seemed to announce his downfall to the entire city. Michael stared out the window with a lost expression, watching the tall office buildings where he used to have business meetings fly by. Shame began to creep into his mind, imagining how the neighbors in his exclusive gated community had gathered that morning to watch as he was dragged from his house like a common thief. He, Michael Anderson, the young, successful executive, respected by all, was now being treated like a criminal. But behind the shame, his arrogance still burned. He still believed that money and connections could solve everything. He thought this was just a bluff from Grace's distraught family and that everything would soon be settled. Upon arriving at the police precinct, Michael was led directly to a small, cold, musty interrogation room. The room contained only a metal table and two rickety chairs. The flickering, fluorescent light on the ceiling added to the grim atmosphere. They shoved Michael roughly into a chair and uncuffed him, only to cuff one hand to the table. He tried to shout at the officer, demanding his right to a phone call and more respectful treatment. But his shouts only echoed off the cold concrete walls. No one listened. The officers left him alone in there for nearly 2 hours. The silence was deliberately crafted to break his will, to make Michael anxious, furious, and finally, terrified. He started tapping on the table. His leg bounced impatiently, and cold sweat began to soak his expensive, now wrinkled shirt. The metal door finally creaked open, a sound that grated on the ears. Mr. Hayes, the family's attorney, entered calmly, followed by a senior police detective. Mr. Hayes did not sit down. He stood on the other side of the table, looking down at Michael with a contempt that made Michael's blood boil. Michael immediately unleashed his fury, accusing Mr. Hayes and Grace's family of kidnapping and defamation. He stubbornly insisted that what happened the previous night was a private marital issue that should not be interfered with by third parties, let alone the police. Michael even arrogantly offered a sum of money to close the matter right then and there, believing everyone's integrity had a price. Mr. Hayes gave a slight smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick red folder. With deliberate movements, he spread photos from Grace's forensic exam across the table, right in front of Michael's face. The photos were horrific. Grace's face bruised in shades of purple and blue, her lip torn and stitched, and the contusions on her arms and back proving the violence had been repeated. Michael looked away, unable to face the result of his own actions, but Mr. Hayes forced him to look. The lawyer explained in an emotionless voice that this forensic exam not only proved the physical violence from the previous night, but had also uncovered a dark secret Michael had carefully guarded all. This time, The detective accompanying Mr. Hayes then placed a lab report on top of the photos. Michael frowned, not understanding what a blood test had to do with an assault case. Mr. Hayes explained that after Grace was brought to safety that morning, the doctor performed a full workup because she had been complaining of frequent dizziness and weakness for the past few months. The lab results surprised everyone. Traces of a low-dose sedative, a benzodiazepine, were found in Grace's blood, the same substance found in the bottle of vitamins Michael gave his wife every night. Michael's face, previously red with anger, turned paper white. His secret was out. For the last 6 months, Michael had indeed been secretly mixing a sedative into Grace's drinks or vitamins, so she would fall asleep quickly and not ask too many questions when he came home late or went out to see Tiffany. He thought his actions were clever, a subtle way to silence his wife without violence, but in the eyes of the law, it was a felony. Mr. Hayes leaned forward, locking his gaze on Michael's eyes, and told him this was no longer a simple case of domestic violence. This was premeditated, attempted murder, and systematic poisoning of a spouse. Michael was speechless, his tongue paralyzed. He tried to deny it, saying they were just normal vitamins, that the lab results must be mistaken or falsified, but his voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to himself. The fact that Grace had known and kept silent all this time made him shudder. It turned out Grace's silence wasn't because the drug was working perfectly, but because she was gathering piece after piece of evidence to trap him. Michael realized he had fallen into a trap of his own making. The wife he thought was foolish and submissive turned out to be a much smarter and more lethal adversary than he had ever imagined. The detective began to read the sections of the penal code he would be charged under. The potential sentence was no longer a matter of months, but over a decade in prison. The shadow of a destroyed career, a ruined reputation, and a life behind bars began to dance before Michael's eyes. He sank into his chair, shoulders slumped, his arrogance shattered and replaced by real terror. He begged to be allowed to speak with Grace. He pleaded with Mr. Hayes to convey his request for forgiveness. But Mr. Hayes simply gathered his documents back into his briefcase. Before leaving, he told him that Grace no longer wanted to hear a single word from Michael's mouth and that the only communication between them from now on would be through the judge's gavel in court. The metal door slammed shut again, leaving Michael alone with the shadows of his destruction. After hours of uncertainty, Michael was finally given the chance to make one phone call. His mind raced. He couldn't call his mother in his small hometown. The old woman would surely have a heart attack upon hearing the news. He couldn't call his colleagues from the office. That would be professional suicide. The only name that came to mind was Tiffany, his mistress. The woman who had coddled him with sweet words and promises of fidelity. Michael was sure Tiffany would help him. Didn't they love each other? Didn't Tiffany always say he was everything to her? With trembling hands, Michael dialed Tiffany's number from the precinct phone. The line rang several times before she finally answered. Tiffany's flirtatious voice greeted him, asking why he was calling from an unknown number. Michael, in a voice he tried to keep as calm as possible, explained that he had a small problem with the police because of a complaint from Grace. He lied, downplaying the issue, saying it was just a minor misunderstanding and that he needed money for bail to get out temporarily. Michael promised to pay her back double as soon as he could access his bank account. Hearing the words double back, Tiffany's tone immediately shifted to enthusiasm. The woman agreed to come with her savings, thinking this was a small investment to completely win over Michael's heart and fortune. 2 hours later, Tiffany arrived, her glamorous style completely out of place, with large, dark sunglasses and a designer handbag strutting through the police station as if it were a shopping mall. After a tedious administrative process and the payment of a considerable bail, Michael was finally allowed to leave with a status of supervised release. He had to report weekly and could not leave the city limits. As he walked through the precinct doors and breathed the free air, Michael felt enormous relief. He wrapped an arm around Tiffany's waist, thanking her affectionately, and told her that he would soon sort things out with Grace and divorce her so they could live happily together. Tiffany beamed, imagining herself soon becoming Mrs. Anderson and living in that luxurious mansion. However, the relief was short-lived. Mr. Hayes, who had apparently been waiting in the lobby, approached them. Without any preamble, the lawyer handed a large manila envelope to Michael. Michael took it with a scowl. Mr. Hayes explained that it was a notice of asset seizure and a statement of property titles. Michael let out a contemptuous laugh, saying Grace had no right to seize anything because the house and cars were bought with his hard work over the years. But Mr. Hayes calmly dismantled that argument. He reminded Michael to reread the prenuptial agreement he had signed without much thought, too eager to marry Grace, who came from a wealthy family. The document clearly stated that the mansion they lived in was an inherited property from Robert, put in Grace's name before the marriage, and therefore not part of their marital assets. The luxury cars Michael drove daily also turned out to have been purchased with funds from Grace's family business account, legally listed as company vehicles that could be recalled at any time. Michael stood in stunned silence, his eyes wide as he read the legal documents. He was just now realizing that all this time he had merely been a passenger in a life of luxury financed by his wife. Michael's large salary over the years had been spent on his lifestyle, online gambling, and spoiling Tiffany, leaving him with virtually no valuable assets of his own. Mr. Hayes then informed him of something else that made Michael's knees weak. Michael's credit cards and access to his bank accounts had already been frozen by the bank due to a complaint of suspected corporate embezzlement filed by Robert that very morning. It turned out an internal audit of the company had been quietly underway for months. So, at that moment, Michael literally didn't have a penny to his name beyond the cash in his wallet. Mr. Hayes departed, leaving them both in the parking lot with a satisfied smile, allowing the bitter reality to sink into Michael's brain. Tiffany, who had heard the entire conversation, began to pull away from his grasp. Her face started to show doubt. Michael, panicked at the change in Tiffany's attitude, tried to convince her that the lawyer was just bluffing. He stubbornly insisted they go to his mansion to prove he was still in control. They took a cab because Michael's car had already been impounded by the police as evidence. Throughout the ride, Michael kept boasting about his business plans and how he would destroy Grace's family. Tiffany remained silent, busy on her phone, likely starting to calculate the profit and loss of her relationship with the man beside her. Upon arriving at the gate of the exclusive community, their cab was stopped by the security guard. Michael got out furiously, shouting at the guard he had known for years to open the barrier. But the guard looked at him coldly and said he had received direct orders from the homeowner, Mrs. Grace Anderson, to prohibit Michael's entry. The gate lock had been changed to a new digital system. Michael flew into a rage. He shook the high iron bars of the gate like a madman, screaming Grace's name. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes to watch the free spectacle with looks of contempt. The climax of Michael's mental breakdown occurred when the guard pointed to a black pile next to the guardhouse. There, inside a large metal barrel, were the smoldering remains of a bonfire. Michael ran over and saw charred pieces of his expensive designer suits, melted Italian leather shoes, and his collection of wristwatches, all destroyed by the fire. All of Michael's personal belongings, the symbols of his status and pride, had been burned to ashes on Grace's orders. Nothing was left. He had no clothes to change into, no home to return to, and no assets to boast of. Michael turned to look at Tiffany, hoping to find compassion. But Tiffany stared at the pile of ashes in horror, and then looked at Michael with a completely new expression. The look of a woman realizing the man before her was not a gold mine, but a disgusting liability. Tiffany backed away slowly, shaking her head when Michael tried to take her hand. In front of the gate of the house he once flaunted as his palace, Michael stood helpless as the evening sky began to darken, heralding the gloomy future that awaited him. The gray evening sky seemed to mock the fate of Michael, now abandoned in front of the gate to his own mansion. The afternoon wind blew hard, carrying the ashes of his expensive burned clothes. Michael stared blankly at the magnificent house, the place where he once felt like a king, now sealed shut to him. He turned to Tiffany, who stood with a disgusted look on her face, clutching her designer handbag as if afraid it too would be set on fire. Michael attempted a smile, a pathetic effort to hide the panic eating away at his sanity. In a forcedly optimistic voice, he suggested they leave. He told her this was just a temporary setback and they could start a new life in her apartment for a while as he found a good lawyer to reclaim his rights. He assured her that Grace wouldn't win forever. They left the luxury residential complex, walking a considerable distance before finally hailing a cab on the main avenue. During the ride to Tiffany's apartment, the atmosphere inside the cab was terribly cold and uncomfortable. Michael chattered endlessly, rambling about his plans for revenge, how he would destroy Grace's family business and make them all kneel for forgiveness. He was trying to convince both himself and Tiffany that he still had power, but Tiffany remained silent. She stared out the window with a vacant expression, her fingers impatiently tapping her phone screen. There were no more affectionate words, no comforting touches, only a wall of ice growing thicker between them. Michael tried to take Tiffany's hand, but she gently pulled it away, excusing herself by saying it was sticky and sweaty. Michael swallowed his disappointment, thinking Tiffany was perhaps just in shock from witnessing the burning of his belongings. Upon arriving in the lobby of the apartment building, for which the annual rent had been paid in full by Michael with his bonus from the previous year, Tiffany walked quickly ahead to the elevator. Michael followed her like a lost puppy. His clothes were wrinkled and smelled sour from the accumulated sweat at the police station. When the apartment door opened, Tiffany did not invite him in with her usual warmth. She tossed her keys on the table and sat directly on the sofa, crossing her legs arrogantly. Michael entered hesitantly, closed the door softly, and tried to sit next to her. But before he could even touch the couch, Tiffany raised a hand, signaling him to stop. Tiffany's gaze, once full of admiration, had now transformed into a calculating, sharp, and penetrating stare. Tiffany asked in a flat, emotionless voice, just to be sure of one thing. She asked if it was true that all the assets, the house, the cars, and the bank accounts Michael had boasted about all this time belonged to Grace, or were at least frozen in Grace's name. Michael fell silent for a moment, then nodded slowly as he tried to explain that it was just a legal technicality that could be resolved. He said he still had his good salary and his position as a director at the company, so money wouldn't be an issue. However, that answer was apparently not what Tiffany wanted to hear. The woman snorted sharply. A cynical laugh escaped her bright red lips. Tiffany stood up, looking Michael up and down, with an expression of contempt that shattered his pride into a million pieces. Tiffany began to unleash everything she had kept hidden behind her sweet mask all this time. She told him she had been with Michael because he was a successful figure who could take her shopping at luxury boutiques, dine at five-star restaurants, and give her the lifestyle she dreamed of. She wasn't interested in a bankrupt middle-aged man with a criminal record who had been kicked out of his own house like a stray cat. The words were like sharp blades cutting into Michael's heart. He stood gaping, unable to believe what he was hearing. He tried to remind Tiffany of the love they shared, the sweet promises of being together until death they used to whisper in bed. Michael knelt at Tiffany's feet, begging for understanding, saying he needed her now more than ever. But Michael's crocodile tears had no effect on Tiffany. The woman was disgusted. She gently pushed his shoulder with her foot to move him away. Tiffany screamed that she was not a charity for the homeless. She reminded him that the lease on this apartment was up next month, and without the flow of money from Michael, she would have to find a new sponsor as soon as possible. Michael's presence would only hinder her search for another rich man. Cruelly, Tiffany grabbed what was left of Michael's belongings, just his wallet and phone, and threw them toward the front door. She ordered him to leave that instant, before she called building security and reported him as an intruder disturbing the peace. Michael stood up, his body trembling. His eyes burned with a mix of pain and rage he couldn't vent. He looked at Tiffany's face one last time, searching for any trace of the woman he once considered an angel. But all he found was the figure of a greedy monster. How true the saying was, money talks. Without it, you're invisible. Michael walked out of the apartment with heavy steps. The door slammed shut right behind him, followed by the sound of the deadbolt turning twice. Michael stood in the silent hallway of the building, alone, homeless, penniless, and now without the love he had so proudly paraded. He realized how stupid he had been to sacrifice a diamond like Grace for a sharp stone like Tiffany, who now cut him until he bled. That night, Michael spent the hours in the restroom of a gas station not far from Tiffany's building. He couldn't sleep well because of the mosquitoes and the cold tile floor, but the hunger twisting his stomach was far more torturous. He only had a few dollars in his wallet, the change from buying cigarettes 2 days ago. He bought a loaf of bread and a bottle of water, eating them ravenously while bemoaning his fate. However, in the midst of his misery, a false spark of hope appeared in his mind. He remembered his job, his career. He was a top-tier marketing director. The company couldn't just fire him over a personal problem. The next morning, he would go to the office, explain everything to the CEO, and request a company loan. With that conviction, Michael tried to close his eyes, hoping for dawn to save what was left of his dignity. The morning sun, which usually invigorated him, now burned Michael's unwashed, sticky skin. He tried to tidy himself up as best he could in the public restroom of the gas station, washing his face and combing his hair with his fingers. His shirt was terribly wrinkled and had a dirt stain on the sleeve, but he forced himself to straighten his shoulders, putting on the mask of authority he used to wear. He spent his last dollars on a rideshare to the skyscraper in the city's financial district, where he had worked for the past 10 years, building his reputation as a brilliant young executive. Arriving at the majestic lobby with its gleaming marble floor, Michael walked in confidently. He expected the security guards to greet him with respect, as always, to open the door for him and ask how he was. But the opposite happened. The two guards on duty at the main entrance whispered to each other as he approached. Their looks were strange, a mix of disgust and pity. They didn't open the door for him, leaving Michael to push the heavy glass door himself. Michael ignored it, thinking they were just being lazy. He walked to the security turnstile for the elevators and swiped his employee ID card. The machine's indicator light flashed red, followed by a long beep indicating access denied. Michael frowned, trying his card again and again. The result was the same: access denied. The line of employees behind him grew longer. Murmurs began to spread. Michael turned and saw dozens of pairs of eyes staring at him. They were no longer looks of admiration, but of contempt. Some female employees covered their mouths as they whispered to their colleagues, pointing at him. Michael's ears were ringing. He caught fragments of phrases like, "That's him, the one who beats his wife." How shameless! His heart pounded. The news had apparently spread faster than a virus. An HR manager named Mr. Roberts, who had once been Michael's subordinate, stepped out of the elevator and approached him. Mr. Roberts's face was expressionless and formal, without the friendly smile he used to show. Without shaking his hand, Mr. Roberts asked him to come to a special room on the ground floor, not his office upstairs. Michael tried to protest, asking why his access was blocked, but Mr. Roberts just replied curtly that it was standard procedure for employees in the termination process. The word termination hit Michael's chest like a sledgehammer. He followed Mr. Roberts with trembling legs past the accusing stares of the receptionists and lobby staff. Inside the small room, the company's CEO, Mr. Sterling, was already seated. The older man, who was normally paternal, now looked at Michael with eyes full of contained anger. On the table was a tablet displaying the viral video of Michael's domestic violence against Grace. The video had already spread widely on social media since the previous night, uploaded by an anonymous account and becoming a national trend. The company's reputation was at stake, as netizens had begun to attack the corporate social media accounts, demanding Michael's dismissal. Mr. Sterling didn't mince words. He placed the termination letter directly in front of Michael. Michael tried to defend himself, pleading that it was a personal matter unrelated to his performance at the office. He reminded Mr. Sterling of the sales targets he had surpassed last month, the profits he had generated for the company. But Mr. Sterling slammed his fist on the table, cutting off Michael's rambling. Mr. Sterling said that integrity was everything in their business. A man capable of beating his own wife to a pulp was not fit to lead a team or carry the company's name. Furthermore, Mr. Sterling revealed a fact that left Michael paralyzed. It turned out the largest investor who had just injected fresh capital into the company last month was a business consortium led by Robert Grace's father. That very morning, a representative from Robert had called directly, threatening to withdraw the entire investment if Michael remained an employee of the company for even one more second. Mr. Sterling had no choice but to get rid of Michael to save hundreds of other employees. Michael was stunned. Only then did he realize how extensive and powerful his wife's family network was, a network he had always underestimated. He wasn't just fighting Grace, He was fighting a giant that could crush him with a snap of its fingers. Mr. Sterling added that Michael was being fired for cause, which meant he would not receive a single cent of severance pay. Moreover, since the case involved criminal offenses and severe ethical violations, Michael's name would be blacklisted by the industry association. This meant no reputable company in the field would want to hire him in the future. The career Michael had built with sweat and blood over 10 years vanished in the blink of an eye, destroyed without a trace. 2 burly security guards entered the room with orders to escort Michael out of the building. Immediately, Michael tried to ask for permission to collect his personal belongings from his desk photos, awards, and important documents, but Mr. Roberts informed him that all of Michael's personal items had already been packed into a cardboard box and placed at the security desk outside. He was strictly forbidden from setting foot in the office areas. Michael was escorted to the exit like a prisoner, walking through the now even more crowded lobby. He felt like he was walking down a hallway in hell. Everyone stared at him. Some recorded with their phones, others openly criticized him. Michael reached the front of the building. The midday sun seemed to burn his skin. The security guard handed him a cardboard box that once held instant noodles, now containing his belongings. Michael received it with trembling hands. He stood on the hot sidewalk, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of the city. People hurried past, busy with their own lives. No one cared about a poorly dressed man who had just lost everything. Michael looked up at the tall building one last time, the building that was once a symbol of his success. He now realized he was completely alone in this cruel world, without a home, without a wife, without a lover, without money, and now without a job. Regret began to seep in, but that regret was too late, far too late. The day of the first mediation hearing arrived, a day that should have been a moment for reconciliation, but for Michael, it felt like Judgment Day. Michael sat in the courthouse waiting area, looking utterly deplorable. The shirt he wore was the only one left in his box of belongings, wrinkled and stained with sweat from being worn for several days without washing. His face was covered in a scruffy beard, his dark circles pronounced, and his body gaunt from lack of food and severe stress. For the past few days, Michael had been sleeping wherever he could, in mosques, in night watchmen's booths, hiding from debt collectors and the scornful looks of those who recognized him from the viral video. He felt insignificant, ashamed, and broken. However, in the darkest corner of his heart, a glimmer of absurd hope remained. He thought that if he begged sincerely, if he showed how much he was suffering now, Grace would surely soften. The Grace he knew was a gentle woman who couldn't bear to see even a cat go hungry, let alone her own husband suffer. The door to the mediation room opened. Michael turned his head quickly, his heart pounding. The plaintiff's party entered. Mr. Hayes led the way with a firm stride, followed by 2 legal assistants. But Michael's eyes were not on them. His eyes were fixed on the figure of the woman walking in their midst. It was Grace. Michael almost didn't recognize her. The Grace who used to look drab in house dresses or simple outfits now radiated an extraordinary glow. She wore a chic blazer and a long skirt in an elegant nude tone, paired with a silk scarf with a delicate print that perfectly framed her face. The bruises on her face had faded, covered by light makeup that highlighted her beauty, which had been hidden for so long under the shadow of domination. There was no longer a look of fear or doubt. Grace walked with her chin held high, exuding an aura of confidence and serenity that was intimidating. When they sat across from each other at the mediation table, Michael felt like a speck of dust before a diamond. The court mediator began the session by asking if there was any possibility of reconciliation. Before Mr. Hayes could respond, Michael interrupted immediately. He slid from his chair, kneeling on the cold floor in front of Grace. He wept. Tears that were part feigned and part real from desperation. Michael began to stammer sweet words he used to use to manipulate Grace. He told her he had made a mistake, that Tiffany had bewitched him, and that he swore he would change to be a better husband. He pleaded for Grace to see his current broken state as proof that karma had caught up with him and that he had suffered enough. He tried to reach for the hem of Grace's skirt, hoping the physical contact would awaken memories of the past. But Grace's reaction was completely unexpected for Michael. Grace didn't pull her foot away in disgust, but she didn't weep with emotion either. Grace simply looked down at the prostrate Michael with an impassive expression, as if looking at an unimportant stranger. Slowly, Grace spoke. Her voice was calm, low, but every syllable was clear and pierced to the bone. Grace told Michael he needn't bother with the act. She said that the Michael she once loved, the husband she was proud of, had actually died the night the first blow landed on her face. The figure before her now was just an empty shell, a cowardly man who only remembered God and his wife when he lost his possessions and his position. Grace stated firmly that not a shred of love remained in her heart. The only thing left was gratitude that God had opened her eyes before it was too late. Michael fell silent, looking up at his wife's face. He saw no anger there. What was more painful, he saw complete indifference. It was the look of someone who had truly moved on. Grace then signaled to Mr. Hayes. The lawyer pulled out a thick document and placed it in front of Michael. Grace explained coolly that this was the additional evidence they would be taking to the criminal courts for embezzlement. The document contained a trail of transfers from Grace's family business accounts that Michael managed. It turned out that for the past 2 years, Michael had frequently forged receipts and inflated budgets, then transferred the difference to Tiffany's personal account. The amount totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. Michael's eyes widened. Cold sweat poured down his face. He thought he had covered that trail carefully. Grace smiled slightly, a lethal smile. She told him that all this time, she had kept quiet not because she didn't know, but because she was waiting for the amount to be large enough to ensure Michael would rot in prison for a longer time. The money Michael stole to spoil his mistress was money intended for orphans, managed by Grace's family foundation. Michael had stolen from the most sacred of places. Grace concluded the conversation by saying she didn't need Michael's apologies. She only needed justice. She stood up, straightened her blazer, and walked out of the room without a single backward glance, leaving Michael still kneeling with his mouth agape, realizing that the legal noose around his neck was now even tighter, strangling him. After the failed mediation and the ever more real threat of prison, Michael felt his world had truly ended. However, his survival instinct still flickered. He remembered one person who would surely never abandon him, no matter how grave his sins: his mother, his own mother. The elderly woman who lived in his hometown had always doted on him, had always defended him, even when he was wrong as a child. Michael was sure that a mother's prayers and testimony could change the situation, or at least lessen his sentence. With the last few coins he found on the street, Michael called his mother from a payphone. He cried inconsolably, twisting the facts. He told her he was being slandered by Grace's wealthy family, that he was being treated unfairly, and he begged her to come to the city to be a character witness at his trial. He needed his mother to tell the judge that Michael was a dutiful son, incapable of violence. His mother, on the other end of the line, sounded shocked and wept hysterically upon learning of her son's fate. The old woman's frail voice made Michael's heart feel a little lighter. He felt he had her support. His mother promised she would come. She said she would sell her only goat to pay for the bus ticket to the city to defend her only son, her pride and joy. Michael hung up the phone, feeling a bit calmer. He thought that, at least at the trial, he wouldn't be alone. The presence of an elderly, frail mother figure would surely evoke the judge's sympathy and make Grace look bad for causing her own mother-in-law to suffer. This was the last cunning strategy left in Michael's brain. The day of the trial finally arrived. The courtroom was packed. The case had become a media sensation, involving a prominent business family and a sensational scandal. Michael sat in the defendant's box wearing an orange jumpsuit provided by the court. His head was bowed, trying to avoid the flashes of reporters' cameras, but his eyes constantly darted to the entrance, waiting for his mother's arrival. And sure enough, not long after, the door opened. His mother entered with hesitant steps, wearing a modest traditional dress and a simple headscarf. Michael's heart leaped with joy. He smiled broadly at his mother, ready to receive a warm, defensive hug. But something was strange. His mother didn't walk toward the public gallery behind him. Instead, she was guided by a court officer toward the witness stand, and even more surprisingly, she was accompanied by Andrew, Grace's brother. Michael frowned in confusion. Why was his mother with the opposing side? Maybe Andrew was just helping the old woman, he thought optimistically. The judge then asked his mother if she was ready to give her testimony. His mother nodded slowly, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. Michael looked at his mother full of hope, signaling with his eyes for her to start talking about what a good son he was. The judge asked, "Ma'am, is it true that the defendant, Michael Anderson, is a respectful and responsible son, as he claims in his defense?" A tense silence filled the room. His mother bowed her head deeply, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Then, slowly, she raised her face to look at Michael. It was not a look of affection, but one filled with hurt, disappointment, and repressed anger. In a hoarse but firm voice, his mother answered, "No, Your Honor. My son Michael is not a respectful son. He is an ungrateful son who has been slowly killing his mother while she is still alive." Michael jolted violently, as if struck by lightning on a clear day. "Mom, what are you saying?" he shouted in panic, but the judge immediately banged his gavel, ordering him to be silent. His mother continued her testimony, her voice trembling terribly. She opened an old cloth bundle she was carrying. Inside was a worn-out old savings passbook. His mother explained that for 10 years she had scrimped and saved from selling vegetables at the market, putting away coin after coin to pay for a pilgrimage, the dream of her lifetime before she died. 2 years ago, Michael came to her town crying, saying he urgently needed capital for a business or he would go bankrupt. Out of pity, his mother gave all her pilgrimage savings to Michael. Michael promised to pay it back in 6 months, but it turned out his mother's sobs grew louder, hushing the entire courtroom, moving everyone. He didn't use that money for a business. A neighbor of mine, whose son works in the city, saw Michael on vacation at the beach with another woman. That woman was not Grace. He used his mother's sacred money for fornication. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Michael was petrified in his seat, his face ashen. He never expected his mother to know about that. He thought his mother was a simple countrywoman, easy to deceive. His mother fixed her gaze on Michael. The tears still fell, but her look grew harder. "I gave birth to him. I nursed him, but I failed to raise him," his mother continued in a heart-wrenching voice. "I am ashamed, Your Honor. I am ashamed to have a son who beats a wife as good as Grace. I am ashamed to have a son who steals from his own mother. I came here not to defend him. I came to see him punished. Let the prison teach him, because I am no longer able." Those words were the final nail in the coffin. His own mother, the one person he expected to be his protector, now stood as his most devastating accuser. Carol, sitting in the public gallery, was seen embracing Michael's mother, who nearly fainted after giving her testimony. It was an image of solidarity between mothers that moved everyone present, except Michael. Michael felt his chest tighten. The oxygen seemed to have vanished from the room. He was betrayed by his own greed, and now, betrayed by his own blood. He looked at his mother, whose face was turned away by Andrew so she wouldn't have to look at him anymore. That day, Michael didn't just lose his freedom, he lost his status as a son. He was an orphan in the saddest sense, abandoned by his own mother because of his behavior, which had long surpassed the bounds of humanity. The atmosphere inside the courtroom that day felt so dense and suffocating, as if the air refused to circulate amidst the peak tension. This was the final day of the trial, the day Michael's fate would be decided by the judge's gavel. Michael sat in the defendant's box, his body even thinner, his face almost unrecognizable. His eyes were wild and terrified, darting around the room, searching for any small crack to escape this bitter reality, but there was no way out. To his right, the prosecution team sat with mountains of evidence files stacked as high as a fortress. To his left, the public defender assigned to him by the state looked resigned and dispirited, aware that this case was a dead end for his client, who had already lost everything. The biggest surprise of the day came when the prosecutor called the final witness. The courtroom door opened, and in walked Tiffany. She walked with her head down, avoiding everyone's gaze, especially Michael's. Tiffany's appearance was vastly different from usual. There were no luxurious dresses or sparkling jewelry. She wore simple clothes and no makeup, trying to appear innocent before the law. Michael started in his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had thought that perhaps Tiffany still held some affection for him, or at least some solidarity. But that hope was shattered as soon as Tiffany began to speak into the microphone. To save herself from legal repercussions as a recipient of embezzled funds, Tiffany had made a deal with the prosecution to become a cooperating witness. Before the panel of judges, Tiffany placed all the blame on Michael. She testified through crocodile tears that it was Michael who had forced her to accept the money. She confessed that Michael was a manipulative man who had trapped her in a forbidden relationship with false promises of luxury. Tiffany even recounted how Michael frequently belittled Grace in front of her, calling his wife a foolish woman who was easy to deceive. Every word from Tiffany's mouth was like a knife in Michael's back. The man screamed hysterically, calling Tiffany a traitor and a liar, but his outbursts only made him look worse and more unstable in the judge's eyes. Security officers quickly restrained Michael, forcing him back into his seat and silencing him. After hearing all the witnesses and examining the evidence, it was time for the verdict. The presiding judge, a mature man with thick glasses and a stern face, began to read the sentence in a voice that resonated throughout the courtroom. The judge declared that Michael had been found legally and convincingly guilty of committing crimes of aggravated domestic violence resulting in physical injury and psychological trauma, premeditated attempted poisoning, as well as large-scale corporate embezzlement. There were no mitigating factors for Michael's sentence. His uncooperative attitude, lack of sincere remorse, and even his audacity in using his own mother's money became aggravating factors. The judge took a deep breath before imposing the maximum penalty. Michael was sentenced to 15 years in prison, plus a fine of hundreds of thousands of dollars. If the fine was not paid, the prison term would be extended, and any remaining assets would be seized by the state. The gavel struck 3 times with a loud thud that sounded like a funeral bell for Michael's future. The courtroom immediately erupted. Muted applause came from the public benches, filled with Grace's family and women's rights activists who had followed the case. Michael was crushed. His body slumped in the chair as if his bones had been removed. He sobbed loudly, calling his mother's name. But his mother was no longer there. She had returned to her town with a broken heart after her testimony last week, refusing to visit Michael even once. As the court officers began to drag Michael back to the holding cell, his gaze fixed on one spot. In the front row, Grace stood up slowly. The woman did not clap, nor did she smile maliciously. Her face was serene, peaceful, and full of relief. She hugged Robert and Carol, then politely nodded to the prosecutor. Grace looked radiant, so far beyond Michael's reach, as if they were creatures from different dimensions. Michael tried to scream Grace's name, hoping she would turn, even for a second, hoping to see some remnant of feeling in her eyes. But Grace did not turn at all. She turned and walked toward the exit, surrounded by people who loved her, leaving Michael still struggling as he was dragged by the officers into the darkness of the prison corridor. That day, Michael finally understood that the harshest punishment was not physical imprisonment, but the reality that he had been completely erased from the lives of the people who once sincerely loved him. He was now just a bad memory, a stain that had been successfully washed away. 5 years later, the scorching midday sun baked the asphalt of the capital's crowded, dusty streets. On the outskirts of the city, in a densely populated, low-income area, stood a small, greasy spoon diner with walls blackened by vehicle exhaust. In the back of the diner, near a foul-smelling drain, a thin, gaunt man with graying, disheveled hair squatted, washing a pile of dirty dishes. That man was Michael. He had just been released on parole a few months ago due to prison overcrowding, but freedom had not brought him a better life. With an extensive criminal record and a name blacklisted everywhere, no company would hire him, not even as a security guard. His assets were long gone, used to pay fines and restitution, and his family back home had completely cut ties. His mother had passed away a year after he went to prison, taking her disappointment to the grave, having never once visited him. Michael now worked odd jobs, sometimes as a porter at the market, sometimes collecting plastic bottles, and now as a dishwasher at this diner, for a wage that barely covered food and cigarettes. His back ached frequently from the effects of sleeping on cold prison floors, and he had lost several teeth due to malnutrition. His hands, once soft from holding only expensive pens and steering luxury cars, were now rough, cracked, and smelled of cheap soap. The diner's owner, a stout, ill-tempered woman, frequently yelled at him if he worked too slowly or broke a glass. Michael, once proud and arrogant, could now only bow his head obediently. His spirit had been broken and trampled by the harsh wheel of life, which had spun downward. That afternoon, the diner was quiet. Michael rested for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow with his dirty shirt sleeve. His eyes drifted to the old tube television hanging in the corner. The news was broadcasting a special report on the Inspirational Woman of the Year awards. The TV screen showed an elegant hotel ballroom glittering with crystal chandeliers. The camera then focused on a woman walking onto the stage to receive a trophy. Michael's heart seemed to stop. The plastic cup in his hand fell to the floor. The woman on the television screen was Grace. She looked much younger and more beautiful than she had 5 years ago. Her scarf was elegantly arranged, her smile full of confidence. The narrator explained that Grace was now the owner of a successful catering company and a chain of traditional restaurants with branches in several major cities, as well as the founder of an organization that helped victims of domestic violence recover and become independent. Standing beside Grace was a handsome man who looked at her with pride and love. He was Grace's new husband, a respected specialist doctor known for his generosity. In the audience, Robert and Carol were seen applauding while holding an adorable little boy, Grace's son, from her second marriage. They were all laughing happily, a picture of a perfect, complete, and warm family. Michael stood frozen, staring at the blurry screen. He saw the life that could have been his, if only he hadn't been greedy, if only he hadn't betrayed, if only he had been grateful. Regret struck his chest with brutal force, leaving him breathless. He remembered how Grace had cared for him with devotion, how she had always looked at him with the same love she now gave her new husband. Michael had thrown away a diamond to chase after trash, and now he had to live in that trash. Tears rolled down from the corners of his wrinkled eyes, wetting his dirty cheeks. "Hey, what are you doing just standing there like an idiot?" the diner owner shouted, snapping Michael out of his reverie. The woman placed an aluminum plate on the table near where he was squatting. "Here's your lunch. Eat up and then get back to the dishes. Customers are coming in." Michael looked at the contents of the plate. Cold, day-old white rice with some gravy from a pot roast, already greasy, and a small piece of tough, burnt meat. It was the scrapings from the bottom of the pot, normally thrown out or given to a cat, but today it was his lunch ration. Michael's hungry stomach growled painfully. He took the plate with trembling hands. The aroma of the stew, though stale and mixed with the smell of soap, instantly threw his memories back to that morning 5 years ago. He remembered that morning, the morning he woke up to the smell of a perfect pot roast made by Grace. Tender, choice beef, spices that had penetrated every fiber, served on a luxurious dining table with all her love. The morning he arrogantly felt like a winner, capable of trampling the wife who had prepared that delicious meal. Back then, he had rejected a meal from paradise for his ego, and now, here, by a stinking drain, he had to eat the bitter-tasting remnants of a stew to survive. Michael brought the rice and cold gravy to his mouth. It was tasteless and sad, but each bite felt like a knife twisting in his heart. He ate while he cried, sobbing uncontrollably. Tears dripped onto the plate, mixing with the gravy. He ate ravenously because he was hungry, but also with indescribable pain. He realized this was his true last meal, not the luxurious breakfast he had left on his dining table years ago, but these leftovers that had become the symbol of his life's utter destruction. On the television screen, Grace waved as she concluded her speech, met with a thunderous round of applause. In the dark corner of the diner, Michael choked on his own sobs, alone, humiliated, and forgotten. Karma had completed its task perfectly. The rain fell softly, wetting the windows of Grace's warm, bright kitchen. A very familiar aroma once again filled the room, the smell of simmering beef broth, mixed with rich spices like garlic, thyme, and bay leaves. Grace was cooking pot roast, but this time the atmosphere was completely different from 5 years ago. There were no bruises on her face, no fear clutching her chest, and no vengeful plans brewing in her mind. She stirred the large pot, humming softly, wearing a cute pastel-colored apron. Today was her second wedding anniversary with her new husband, Dr. Arthur, a pediatrician her family had introduced her to. In another corner of the city, dark and damp, Tiffany was huddled in the corner of her tiny rented room. The door was being pounded on from the outside by the landlady, demanding 3 months of overdue rent. Tiffany covered her ears, trembling with fear. The beauty she once flaunted as capital to attract rich men had now faded, consumed by stress and a poor lifestyle. Her face looked prematurely aged, with fine lines appearing at the corners of her sunken eyes. After the case came to light and Tiffany's name was tarnished everywhere, no respectable man wanted to be near her. She ended up plus as the mistress of unfaithful, coarse, and stingy men until she was finally discarded as she began to age. Tiffany looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror on her wardrobe, seeing a pathetic woman who once felt victorious for stealing another's husband, now aware that she was just a rotating trophy that had lost its value. Back at Grace's house, a pair of strong arms wrapped gently around her waist from behind. Grace smiled, leaning her head on her husband's shoulder. Dr. Arthur kissed her cheek and praised the appetizing aroma of the food. There was no shouting, no insults, no demands. Only sincere appreciation. Grace turned off the stove and turned to face her husband. She briefly remembered a shadow of the past, of the pot roast she had served Michael as a farewell. Back then, the stew was a symbol of her anger, a symbol of her wounded dignity. But today, Grace had reclaimed the meaning of that meal. This pot roast was no longer about Michael. This pot roast was about love, about family, and about the future. That night, they had dinner with Robert and Carol, who had come to visit. Laughter filled the dining room. In the midst of the warm conversation, Grace glanced at the calendar on the wall. She paused for a moment. Today's date was the exact same as the date of that abusive night 5 years ago. But what made Grace smile with relief was the realization that she had almost forgotten. She no longer marked this day as a day of mourning or trauma. The memory of Michael, of the beatings and the betrayal, had faded into a small speck in the past that no longer hurt. Grace realized that the best revenge was not seeing your enemy suffer, but living so happily that you forget your enemy ever existed. Outside the fence of Grace's home, an old trash collector staggered through the rain, carrying a wet sack. He paused for a moment, smelling the aroma of pot roast carried on the wind from the ventilation of the luxurious house. His stomach rumbled, his mouth watered. That trash collector, Michael, stared at the warm yellow light glowing from the dining room window. He could see the silhouettes of a happy family inside, feeling a heart-wrenching pain, but he knew he didn't even deserve to touch the gate. With heavy steps, Michael lowered his head and walked on, away into the darkness of the night, carrying his eternal regret. Meanwhile, inside the house, Grace laughed freely, truly free and whole again. If this story made you reflect on the value of respect, loyalty, and how karma always finds its way, I would love to know your opinion. What would you do in Grace's place? Have you ever known someone who didn't value what they had until they lost it all? Tell me in the comments. I love reading your stories and reflections. If this video touched your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. Sharing this video also helps more people hear this message about the consequences of our actions.